Welcome to Infidelity Tales Lab. We're grateful you've chosen to join us today. Tell us, which part of the world are you watching from? Big city? Small town? Country? We'd love to know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundations. While Harrington's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up Ford pickup as he drove down the winding road toward Crystal Creek, the small Montana town he'd escaped 15 years ago. The truck had belonged to his father, a hard-working rancher who'd taught Lyle two important lessons before lung cancer took him. Never trust anyone completely and never leave a debt unpaid. The autumn leaves swirled across the cracked asphalt as Lyle's mind drifted back to when he first met Valerie Pennington. It was at Bud's Diner, where she waited tables while attending community college. He'd been a rough-edge construction worker with big dreams, saving every penny to start his own business. Valerie, with her honey blonde hair and disarming smile, had ambitions that matched his own. "You're different from the other guys around here," she'd told him that night as he walked her home. "You've got plans." Their courtship had been swift and passionate. Within 6 months, they were married in a small ceremony at her parents' backyard. Lyle's best friend, Preston Walsh, stood as his best man. To new beginnings, Preston had toasted his arm around his wife, Melody. The four of them had been inseparable back then. Lyle pulled into the parking lot of Rusty's hardware store, where he'd once worked weekends. The closed sign hung crooked in the window, another business that hadn't survived the economic downturn. He checked his watch, a simple Timex, not the Patek Philippe tucked away in his briefcase. That would come later. His phone buzzed. Aurora, his executive assistant. "The satellite office is ready, Mr. Harrington, and the files you requested on Thorn Investments are on your secure server." "Good. What about the property acquisitions?" "Finalized yesterday. You now own 78% of downtown Crystal Creek, including the Grand Lake Hotel, where the reunion will be held. All through shell companies, as requested." Lyle smiled. "Perfect. And my other request? The helicopter is on standby. Pilot certified, and the Harrington Aviation logo has been added, as instructed. You're worth every penny, Aurora. That's why you pay me the big bucks, sir. Will there be anything else?" "No. I'll handle the rest personally." Lyle ended the call and gazed at the faded high school football field across the street. There, 15 years ago, he'd been the promising quarterback who turned down college scholarships to stay in town and build something with Valerie. Everyone had called him a fool. They weren't wrong. Chapter 2. Betrayal Seed. 5 years into their marriage, Lyle's construction business had begun to thrive. Small projects led to larger contracts, and soon Harrington Construction was handling major developments across 3 counties. Valerie had quit waitressing and worked as his office manager, handling the books while he supervised job sites. Their modest ranch home had been replaced by a custom-built house on the lake, Valerie's dream home. Lyle worked 16-hour days to give her everything she wanted. When she mentioned starting a family, he agreed, though privately he worried about balancing fatherhood with his growing business. The first signs of trouble appeared when Dominic Thorne arrived in Crystal Creek, a Silver Spoon Trust Fund kid from Boston with plans to develop luxury vacation properties around the lake. Thorne had the connections and capital Lyle lacked. When Thorne Investments won the contract for the Grand Lake Hotel project, a job Lyle had bid on, it stung, but he'd accepted it as business. "Don't worry, buddy," Preston had said over beers. "There'll be other projects." Preston's construction supply company had been struggling, so Lyle had thrown him some business, ordering materials through him even when other suppliers offered better prices. That's what friends did. What friends didn't do was what Lyle discovered that rainy Tuesday in April. He'd come home early, soaked and exhausted after a site inspection. The house was quiet, but Valerie's car was in the garage. Thinking she might be napping, he'd quietly made his way upstairs, only to freeze at the sound of laughter coming from their bedroom. The door was ajar. Through the crack, he saw Valerie, his wife, wrapped around Dominic Thorne, her wedding ring glinting on the nightstand. "Lyle's so obsessed with his business, he doesn't even notice," Valerie was saying. 6 months, and he hasn't suspected a thing. Dominic's laugh was low and smug. "The poor bastard. He has no idea you're planning to leave him. Once the divorce is final and I get my settlement, we can stop sneaking around." and the business information you've been giving me has been invaluable. His bid for the riverfront project? I'll undercut him by just enough to secure it next week. Lal had backed away silently, rage building like a storm. At his office, he discovered the extent of the betrayal. Financial records had been accessed, confidential proposals viewed, client information compromised, and the digital fingerprints all led back to Valerie's computer. A call to his attorney that night set everything in motion. By morning, Lal had changed all passwords, secured his files, and begun transferring assets. By noon, Valerie's access to company accounts was terminated. By evening, when she returned home, she found the locks changed and divorce papers waiting on the porch, along with photographs documenting her affair. The divorce had been brutal. Valerie claimed half of everything, including the business she'd helped build. Her attorney, a shark named Westfield, had painted Lyle as a workaholic who'd neglected his wife. But Lyle's evidence of her industrial espionage changed everything. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted upon, which Valerie had signed, confident in her hold over him, held firm. She left the proceedings with a fraction of what she'd expected, her reputation in tatters. 2 weeks later, she moved in with Dominic Thorne, who'd won the riverfront project as planned. What no one knew, not even his attorney, was that Lyle had already set in motion a plan that would take years to execute. A plan to systematically destroy everyone who had betrayed him. Chapter 3. Ashes in Embers. The months following the divorce were the darkest of Lyle's life. Thorne Investments, using information Valerie had stolen, outbid Harrington Construction on 3 major projects. Suppliers who once offered Lyle favorable terms suddenly became difficult. Longtime clients grew hesitant. The business he'd built with sweat and sacrifice began to crumble. Then came his second betrayal. Preston Walsh, his supposed best friend, had been seen golfing with Dominic Thorne. A week later, Preston's supply company secured an exclusive contract with Thorne Investments. When confronted, Preston had the audacity to look ashamed. "It's just business, Lyle. My company was going under. Dominic offered me an exclusive supplier arrangement if I gave him some insights into your operations." "What insights?" Lyle had asked, his voice dangerously calm. Preston's eyes couldn't meet his. "Cost structures, supplier relationships, your contingency plans for the Mason Creek project." The Mason Creek project, a development that represented Lyle's last chance to save his business. The project he just lost to Thorne Investments. "Get out," Lyle had said quietly. "And if you value your life, never speak to me again." That night, alone in his rented apartment, the lake house lost in the financial fallout, Lyle contemplated ending it all. His business was failing, his marriage was over, his friends had betrayed him, and his reputation in Crystal Creek was ruined. But as dawn broke, something hardened inside him. He would not end. He would not break. He would rebuild, stronger and more ruthless than before. And one day, he would return to collect the debts owed to him, with interest. Lyle liquidated what remained of his assets in Crystal Creek and disappeared. Some said he'd moved west to Seattle or Portland. Others heard he'd gone east to rebuild. No one really knew, and after a while, no one really cared. Crystal Creek moved on. Dominic Thorne's developments flourished. Valerie became Mrs. Thorne and the town's social queen. Preston's supply business expanded, riding the wave of Thorne's success. For 5 years, there was no sign of Lyle Harrington, until a new holding company, Phoenix Acquisitions, began quietly purchasing distressed properties in neighboring counties. Few connected it to the construction worker who'd left town with his tail between his legs. Even fewer noticed when Phoenix expanded into helicopter leasing, buying a fleet of specialized aircraft for emergency services and executive transport. 10 years after leaving Crystal Creek, Lyle Harrington had transformed himself into the CEO of Harrington Holdings, a diversified company with interests in real estate, aviation, and technology. His net worth had grown exponentially, but he lived modestly, driven by a single purpose. In corporate circles, he became known as the Ghost, ruthless in negotiations, meticulous in planning, and utterly merciless to those who crossed him. Competitors who tried to undermine him mysteriously found their own businesses faltering. Those who betrayed his trust disappeared from the industry, professionally ruined. All the while, he kept tabs on Crystal Creek, on Dominic and Valerie Thorne, whose marriage had produced 2 children and whose public image as the town's power couple masked growing problems. On Preston Walsh, whose supply company had expanded across the state. On the town that had once been his home. When the invitation to the 15-year high school reunion arrived, forwarded from an old address, Lal smiled for the first time in years. It would be held at the Grand Lake Hotel, now the crown jewel of Thorne Investments. Or so Dominic thought. The time had come to return home. Chapter 4: Shadow Empire. Aurora Martinez hadn't planned on becoming the right hand to one of the most enigmatic businessmen in the Pacific Northwest. A former military intelligence officer with a degree in economics, she'd been working as a security consultant when Lyle Harrington approached her with an unusual proposition. I need someone who understands strategy, values discretion, and isn't afraid to operate in gray areas, he'd told her during their first meeting. Your background suggests you're that person. The salary he offered was triple what she was making. The work was challenging and complex, but it was the intensity in his eyes, the controlled fury, that convinced her to accept. Here was a man with purpose, and Aurora had always been drawn to purpose. 7 years later, she remained the only person who knew the full scope of Lyle's revenge plan. She'd helped architect his empire, structured to serve a single, devastating goal. The acquisitions in Crystal Creek are complete, she reported, sliding a file across his desk in the Seattle headquarters of Harrington Holdings. We now control the water treatment plant, the power substation serving the North Shore developments, the regional medical center, and, as of yesterday, the mortgage on Preston Walsh's home and business. Lyle nodded, studying the map where their holdings were highlighted. And Thorne remains unaware? Completely. Each acquisition was made through a different shell corporation. On paper, they appear to be unrelated entities with different ownership structures. His financial position? Aurora pulled up a series of charts on her tablet. Overextended. The economic downturn hit his luxury developments hard. The Grand Lake Hotel is operating at 40% occupancy. He's leveraged properties to secure loans for new projects that aren't performing. His personal spending hasn't adjusted to the new reality. And Valerie? Aurora hesitated. She's been active. There are credit card receipts from luxury retailers, spa treatments, weekend trips. She's also made several large cash withdrawals over the past year. Our sources indicate marital discord. Children: Braden, 14, and Madeline, 12. Both attend Westridge Academy, a private school in Missoula. Braden has disciplinary issues, 2 suspensions this year. Madeline is academically gifted but socially isolated. Lyle's expression remained neutral. They're Thorne's problem, not mine. Aurora nodded. She'd never heard Lyle express any desire for family or mention regrets about his childless marriage. His focus remained singular. The reunion is 3 weeks away, she reminded him. All arrangements are in place. Your plane leaves tomorrow for Missoula, where you'll pick up the truck from storage. You prepared the dossiers on the other attendees? Yes. Most notable is Thomas Rollins, who's now the mayor of Crystal Creek. He was friendly with Thorne during the divorce proceedings. Caroline Decker runs the local newspaper. She covered your business failures extensively, often quoting anonymous sources that were clearly feeding her information to shape the narrative. Lyle allowed himself a small smile. Both will be useful. Aurora cleared her throat. There's one more thing. Preston Walsh received a diagnosis last month. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Prognosis is less than a year. For a moment, something flickered across Lyle's face, perhaps a ghost of the friendship that once was. Then it hardened. That changes nothing. He made his choice. As Aurora left, Lyle turned to the window, gazing at the Seattle skyline. 15 years of meticulous planning, of building an invisible empire designed specifically to crush those who had wronged him. 3 weeks until it all culminated. He felt nothing but cold anticipation. Chapter 5: Pieces in Motion. Mayor Thomas Rollins was finishing his morning coffee when the email arrived from an unfamiliar address. phoenix.acquisitions@securemail.com. The subject line read, "Urgent, Crystal Creek Water Treatment Facility." The message was brief but alarming. Phoenix Acquisitions had purchased the privately owned water treatment facility serving Crystal Creek and would be implementing a 40% rate increase for commercial properties, effective immediately. Hotels, with their high water usage, would see even steeper increases. Rollins choked on his coffee. The Grand Lake Hotel was the town's largest employer and biggest water consumer. A rate hike of this magnitude would devastate its already precarious finances, and Dominic Thorne, the mayor's biggest campaign contributor, would be furious. His call to Phoenix Acquisitions was answered by a polite but firm representative who explained that the rate increases were non-negotiable, but offered to arrange a meeting with a company executive during the following week's Crystal Creek Business Association dinner. Across town, Caroline Decker stared at a similar email regarding her newspaper's printing facility, which apparently now belonged to another mysterious corporation, Osprey Holdings. The lease terms were being restructured at triple the current rate. Preston Walsh received no email. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with a banker who explained that his business loan had been sold to a private equity firm called Talon Investments. They were calling in the loan, all $4.7 million, due in 30 days. There must be some mistake, Preston protested, his face ashen. "We've never missed a payment. It's within their legal rights," the banker said apologetically. "The acceleration clause in your agreement is quite clear." As Preston staggered from the bank, his phone rang. It was Dominic Thorne, and he wasn't happy. "What the hell is going on, Preston? The Grand Lakes water rates just shot through the roof, and now my supplier in Missoula says you can't fulfill our materials order for the Lakeside Villas renovation." "I'm having some financial complications," Preston managed. "Dominic, I need a loan, just to tide me over." The silence on the other end was deafening. "You know I would if I could, Preston, but I'm stretched thin myself right now. The hotel's barely breaking even, and Valerie's spending is out of control." As these dominoes began to fall, while Harrington was driving his father's restored truck along the familiar roads of Crystal Creek, he passed the welcome sign, now sponsored by Thorne Investments, and allowed himself a grim smile. In his pocket was the reunion RSVP he'd sent a week earlier. While Harrington, +1, the +1 wasn't a person, but rather the culmination of 15 years of planning. That evening, he checked into a modest motel on the outskirts of town, paid cash, and used his laptop to access a secure server. The surveillance feed from the Grand Lake Hotel showed Dominic Thorne's office, phone pressed to his ear, expression growing increasingly desperate as he made call after call. Valerie appeared in the doorway, elegant in designer clothes, her face tight with anger. Though the feed had no audio, Lal didn't need it. The body language told the story. Accusations, recriminations, the marriage of convenience unraveling under financial pressure. Lal opened another window on his computer. Stock prices for Thorne Investments had dropped 12% that day following rumors of liquidity issues. By Monday, when the markets reopened, those rumors would intensify thanks to strategic information Aurora was feeding to key financial bloggers. Another click showed him Preston Walsh's home. The hidden cameras installed months ago, capturing Preston sitting alone in his darkened living room, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him, head in his hands. Lal felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not joy, not even anger anymore. Just the methodical execution of a plan long in motion. He picked up his phone and dialed Aurora. "Phase 1 is complete," he said. "Begin Phase 2. Chapter 6, Converging Storms." The week before the reunion transformed Crystal Creek. Workers appeared overnight, renovating storefronts along Main Street that had stood empty for years. The old Miller property, 200 acres of prime lakefront land that Dominic Thorne had tried repeatedly to acquire, was suddenly abuzz with surveyors and construction equipment bearing the logo of Harrington Holdings. The announcement in the Crystal Creek Chronicle, now printed on significantly more expensive paper, was modest but impactful. Harrington Holdings to develop eco-friendly resort complex. The accompanying architectural renderings showed a stunning sustainable development that would dwarf the Grand Lake Hotel. Mayor Rollins found himself cornered by excited business owners at the weekly chamber breakfast. Is it true? Is Lal Harrington really back? This development will bring hundreds of jobs. I heard he's worth billions now. Rollins, who'd casually dismissed Lal years ago while aligning himself with Dominic Thorne, felt sweat beading on his forehead. I haven't had any direct communication with Mr. Harrington yet, but the town certainly welcomes investment. Across town, in the Grand Lake Hotel's penthouse suite, Dominic Thorne hurled his coffee mug against the wall. How the FUCK did this happen? He roared, brandishing the newspaper. Harrington? That pathetic loser. I ran out of town. Valerie Thorne flinched, her hand automatically touching the fading bruise on her arm, a souvenir from Dominic's last outburst. 15 years of marriage to a man she'd once thought was her ticket to wealth and status had taught her that money couldn't compensate for living with a narcissistic tyrant. Maybe we should reach out to him, she suggested carefully. Make peace. If his development goes forward, it could destroy the hotel. Make peace. Dominic's laugh was ugly. The man has no leverage. These plans will never get approved. I own this town, remember? But his confidence rang hollow. The mysterious companies that had acquired key Crystal Creek infrastructure were systematically increasing costs for Thorne properties while offering discounts to others. The hotel's online reservation system had experienced technical glitches that canceled bookings. Key staff had resigned after receiving lucrative offers elsewhere. And the reunion, the event that was supposed to showcase the Grand Lake Hotel to successful alumni, was a day away. Mr. Mayor, so glad you could make time for me. Thomas Rollins found himself shaking hands with the last person he expected to see in his office, Lal Harrington. Gone was the rough construction worker. In his place stood a lean, impeccably dressed man with steel-gray eyes that seemed to look through him. Lyle, what a surprise. I'd heard rumors you were back in town. More than rumors, Tom. I'm investing significantly in Crystal Creek's future. I trust my development plans will receive the same expedited approvals that Thorne Investments has enjoyed over the years. Rollins swallowed hard. Well, there's a process, environmental impact studies, zoning considerations, all addressed in our comprehensive proposal. Lyle interrupted smoothly, placing a thick binder on the desk, along with a substantial commitment to infrastructure improvements and a new community center. He leaned forward slightly. I also have detailed records of certain irregularities in past approval for Thorne projects. Building code exemptions, expedited permits, waived environmental assessments. It would be unfortunate if those came to light. The mayor's mouth went dry. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a choice, Tom. Support progress for Crystal Creek or face the consequences of your past decisions. Lyle glanced at his watch. I believe your re-election campaign begins next month. Timing is everything. As Lyle left City Hall, his phone buzzed with a text from Aurora, Preston Walsh requesting meeting. Says it's urgent. An hour later, Lyle sat across from his former friend in a coffee shop on the edge of town. Preston had aged 20 years in the decade since Lyle had seen him last. The cancer was clearly taking its toll. I know it was you, Preston said without preamble, his voice raspy. The loan call, the supply chain issues. You're behind it all. Lyle didn't deny it. You chose your side, Preston. I was going bankrupt, Preston whispered. Melody was pregnant. Dominic offered me a lifeline if I gave him information about your business. It was wrong, but I was desperate. And now I'm supposed to forgive you because you're dying? Lyle's voice was emotionless. No. Preston pushed a USB drive across the table. I don't expect forgiveness, but you should have this. It's everything. Communications between Dominic and me, his plans to sabotage your projects, recordings of conversations where he bragged about stealing your wife and destroying your business. I kept it all as insurance. Now it's yours. Lyle pocketed the drive without looking at it. This changes nothing. Preston nodded, resigned. I know. For what it's worth, I've regretted my choice every day for 15 years. He stood shakily. Goodbye, Lyle. As Preston walked away, Lyle felt a momentary twinge of something, not quite regret, not quite sympathy. But it passed quickly. The reunion was tomorrow, and the final act of his revenge was about to begin. That night, as Lyle prepared his simple wardrobe for the event, deliberately choosing worn jeans and a plain button-down shirt. His phone rang. It was Aurora. "Sir, there's been a development. Valerie Thorne just checked into the Pinewood Motel under her maiden name. She's alone, paid cash, and she's carrying a large suitcase." Lyle considered this unexpected twist. "Interesting. Keep monitoring the situation. And Aurora? Make sure everything is ready for tomorrow. It's showtime." Chapter 7. Reunion Revelations. The Crystal Creek High School 15-year reunion was the social event of the season. Held in the Grand Lake Hotel's ballroom, it brought together former classmates, now scattered across the country. Name tags with yearbook photos were distributed at the door, along with champagne and nostalgia. Lyle arrived deliberately late, parking his father's truck prominently near the entrance. He'd chosen his attire carefully, clean but modest clothes that suggested he hadn't made it like many of his peers. The whispers started the moment he walked in. "Is that Lyle Harrington? I thought he left town years ago. Didn't his wife leave him for Dominic Thorne? Poor guy, coming back here after everything." Lyle accepted a name tag and moved through the crowd, nodding politely to former classmates who seemed unsure whether to acknowledge him. He spotted Caroline Decker, the newspaper publisher, chatting with Mayor Rollins. Both tensed visibly when they saw him. "Mr. Mayor, Ms. Decker, lovely event," Lyle said pleasantly, raising his glass in a mock toast. "The Chronicle's coverage of local business has been creative over the years." Caroline flushed. "I report facts, Lyle." "Indeed? I look forward to reading your facts about Harrington Holdings' new development. I'm sure they'll be just as accurate as your reporting on my departure from Crystal Creek." His smile never reached his eyes. Before she could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Valerie Thorne had arrived, looking stunning in a designer dress that highlighted her still youthful figure. But she was alone, and her entrance lacked the triumphant confidence Lyle had expected. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, Valerie seemed to freeze. Then she lifted her chin and walked directly toward him. "Lyle, it's been a long time." Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, carefully concealed with expensive makeup. The diamond necklace at her throat couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders. "Valerie, where's your husband?" "Working. Last-minute crisis at the hotel." Her laugh was brittle. "You know how it is with successful men, always putting business first." The barb fell flat. Lyle merely smiled. Some things never change. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face. "I heard rumors you've done well for yourself." "Did you? Interesting. I heard rumors your marriage isn't quite the fairy tale Crystal Creek believes it to be." Her composure slipped momentarily. "You don't know anything about my life. I know everything about your life, Valerie. Every shopping spree, every argument with Dominic, every secret bank account you've been building. The question is whether everyone else at this reunion will know by the end of the night." The color drained from her face. "What do you want?" "Want? Nothing from you. Not anymore." Lyle's voice was soft, but carried an edge that made her step back. "Enjoy the party. I hear the hotel management is planning a special announcement later." As Lyle moved away, he felt her eyes burning into his back. But he had other matters to attend to. Preston Walsh stood alone by the bar, looking frail and out of place. When he saw Lyle approaching, hope flickered briefly in his eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here," Lyle said. Preston shrugged. "Might be my last chance to see everyone. Doctor says I've got maybe 6 months. I've reviewed what you gave me." And Lyle's expression remained neutral. "Talon Investments will be extending your loan terms. Your company will survive. Your family will be provided for." Relief washed over Preston's gaunt face. "Lyle, don't mistake this for forgiveness." Lyle cut him off. "You're being spared because your children don't deserve to suffer for your mistakes. Nothing more." A commotion from the hotel lobby interrupted them. Dominic Thorne had finally arrived, but instead of making a grand entrance, he was engaged in a heated argument with a man in a business suit who appeared to be serving him papers. "This is outrageous. You can't do this." Dominic's voice carried into the ballroom. "I have contracts." The reunion attendees turned toward the scene, conversations dying as Dominic stormed into the ballroom. his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. His eyes locked on Lyle, and recognition dawned. "You," he snarled, pushing through the crowd. "You're behind this." Lyle stood his ground, calm and unmoved. "Behind what, Dominic? Your business failures? Your marital problems? Your general incompetence? No, those are all your own achievements." Dominic lunged forward, but security guards, wearing Harrington Holdings badges, not hotel uniforms, smoothly intercepted him. "Mr. Thorne, please compose yourself," one said firmly. "Creating a disturbance will only complicate your situation." "My situation?" Dominic spluttered. "This is MY Hotel." "Actually," Lal said quietly, "it's not. Not anymore." The room fell silent as Lyle moved to the center of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, former classmates, I apologize for the disruption. Mr. Thorne has just been informed that the Grand Lake Hotel has a new owner. Harrington Holdings acquired the controlling interest this morning through purchases of Thorne Investments debt instruments." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Valerie, who had been making her way toward Dominic, stopped dead in her tracks, shock written across her face. "This transition will be seamless for hotel staff and guests," Lyle continued smoothly. "In fact, all employees will receive raises and improved benefits packages, effective immediately." Applause broke out among the hotel staff present. Mayor Rollins looked like he might faint. Dominic, held firmly by the security guards, turned purple with rage. "This is impossible. You can't just—" "Oh, but I can," Lyle replied. "Your company has been systematically over-leveraged for years. One might almost think you were being deliberately led into financial ruin by someone with intimate knowledge of your operations and vulnerabilities." He turned to Valerie, whose expression had shifted from shock to calculation. "Someone who might have had motivation to see you fall." Dominic followed Lyle's gaze, his eyes narrowing as they landed on his wife. "Valerie? What is he talking about?" But before she could answer, the ballroom doors opened again, and Aurora Martinez entered, accompanied by two people in business attire. "Mr. Harrington, everything is prepared as you requested," she announced. "And these representatives from the SEC have some questions for Mr. Thorne regarding certain irregularities in his company's financial disclosures." As Dominic was escorted from the room, protesting loudly, Lyle turned back to the stunned reunion attendees. "Please, enjoy the rest of your evening. The open bar is now courtesy of Harrington Holdings." The crowd broke into confused, excited chatter. Through it all, Lyle stood calmly, the eye of the storm he had created. Valerie approached him, her composure regained. "Impressive show," she said, her voice low. "What happens now?" "Now?" Lyle's smile was cold. "Now you get to experience what it feels like when everything you've built crumbles around you." They laughed when I showed up to the class reunion in my old, beat-up truck. My ex-wife pointed. "Some things never change. Still a loser." Minutes later, a helicopter landed outside. My assistant stepped out. "Your ride is here, sir." I turned to my ex. "Actually, I flew myself. I owned the helicopter company and the hotel we're standing in." Her face crumbled. Chapter 8. House of Cards. The morning after the reunion, Crystal Creek awakened to a changed reality. The Crystal Creek Chronicle's front page bore the headline, "Thorne Empire Collapses. SEC Investigation, Assets Frozen." Caroline Decker, mindful of her newspaper's new ownership, had written a scrupulously factual account of Dominic Thorne's financial irregularities, complete with quotes from federal investigators. At the Grand Lake Hotel, now bearing a discreet Harrington Holdings logo at the reception desk, staff whispered excitedly about improved working conditions and the generous bonuses deposited in their accounts overnight. Valerie Thorne found herself locked out of the penthouse suite, her key card deactivated. When she demanded entry at the front desk, the manager politely informed her that the residence was now company property and her personal belongings had been moved to a standard room, paid through the end of the week. "Mr. Harrington suggested you might need time to make new arrangements," the manager explained, handing her a room key. "He also asked me to give you this." The envelope contained divorce papers, already signed by Dominic, who had spent the night being questioned by federal authorities, along with a note in Lyle's handwriting. History repeats itself. Across town, Mayor Rollins called an emergency meeting with the city council to announce his support for Harrington Holdings development plans. This project will transform Crystal Creek's economy, he declared, sweat beading on his forehead as he avoided the questioning gazes of council members who remembered his previous unwavering support for Thorne Investments. In a private hospital room, Preston Walsh received unexpected visitors, his estranged children, now adults, who had been contacted and flown in by Lyle's team. "Dad," his daughter said, tears in her eyes, "we heard about your diagnosis. Why didn't you tell us?" "I didn't want to burden you," Preston replied weakly. "And after everything that happened with the divorce, Mr. Harrington arranged everything," his son explained. "He said you needed family now, regardless of the past." Preston closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Meanwhile, in the Harrington Holdings satellite office established in what had once been Thorne Investments headquarters, Lyle and Aurora reviewed the fallout of the previous night's events. "Dominic Thorne has been released on bail, but he's facing serious charges," Aurora reported. "The evidence we provided to the SEC was comprehensive. His assets remain frozen, and several of his former business associates are now cooperating with authorities. And Valerie checked out of the hotel this morning. According to our sources, she attempted to access several accounts only to find them emptied or frozen. She made calls to former friends, all of which went unanswered or were refused. Her last known location was the bus station." Lyle nodded, something like satisfaction finally flickering in his eyes. "And our other matter?" Aurora handed him a folder. "As you suspected, genetic testing confirms that Braden Thorne is not Dominic's biological son. He's yours." For the first time in their years working together, Aurora saw genuine emotion cross Lyle's face, a complex mixture of anger, vindication, and something more vulnerable. "Does the boy know?" "No, neither do the Thornes, as far as we can tell." Lyle was silent for a long moment. "Keep monitoring the situation. No contact for now." The revelation had been a contingency in his plans, a suspicion based on timing and Valerie's careful control of her supposed fertility issues early in their marriage. Now, confirmed, it introduced a complication he hadn't fully prepared for. That afternoon, as Lyle inspected the hotel property with the management team, he was approached by an unexpected figure, Madeline Thorne, Dominic and Valerie's 12-year-old daughter. Precocious and observant, she had evaded her caretaker to confront him. "You're the man who destroyed my family," she stated, her young face serious beyond her years. Lyle regarded her carefully. "Your father destroyed his own business through dishonest practices. That's why the authorities are involved. And my mother? Did she deserve to have nothing?" "Your mother made choices," Lyle replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Choices have consequences." Madeline studied him with an intensity that reminded him of himself. "My brother says you used to be married to our mom, before our dad." "That's correct. Then you're the one she left, the one whose business they ruined." She wasn't asking. "You seem well-informed for someone your age." Madeline shrugged. "I listen. Adults think kids don't understand, but we do." She looked him directly in the eyes. "What happens to us now? Me and Braden?" The question caught Lyle off guard. In all his planning, in all his focus on revenge, he had never fully considered the collateral damage to the children, one of whom he now knew was his own flesh and blood. "Your father still has resources hidden away," Lyle said finally. "And regardless of what's happened, arrangements will be made to ensure your education and welfare are secured." Madeline's gaze remained skeptical. "Why would you care about our welfare if you hate our parents so much?" "Because," Lyle said, choosing his words carefully, "children shouldn't suffer for their parents' mistakes." As Madeline was led away by the caretaker who had finally located her, Lyle found himself unsettled. The satisfaction he had expected to feel at the culmination of his revenge was complicated by unexpected developments. The confirmation of Braden's paternity, the direct confrontation with Madeline's innocence. That evening, as Lyle sat alone in what had once been Dominic Thorne's office, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Harrington." Valerie's voice was strained but controlled. I assume you're enjoying your victory. It's not about enjoyment, Valerie. It's about justice. She laughed bitterly. Justice? You've destroyed everything. Not just Dominic's business and our marriage, but our children's security, their future. Don't pretend you care about their future now, Lal replied coldly. You were planning to leave them with Dominic while you disappeared with the money you've been siphoning for years. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. How did you? I know everything, Valerie. The accounts and the Caymans. The affair with Congressman Bennett that you thought was your ticket to a new life. The fact that you've been feeding information about Dominic's business to competitors for a percentage. You're not a victim here. You never were. What do you want from me? Her voice had lost its strength. Nothing. You're irrelevant now. Lyle ended the call, contemplating the chessboard he had so meticulously arranged over 15 years. Most of the pieces had fallen exactly as planned, but the discovery about Braden had introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for. What did he owe his biological son, if anything? The boy had been raised by Dominic Thorne, believing himself to be a thorn. Learning the truth would upend his world even further. As Lyle pondered this dilemma, Aurora entered with urgent news. Sir, Dominic Thorne was just found unconscious in his attorney's office. Apparent suicide attempt. He's been taken to Crystal Creek Medical Center in critical condition. The final piece on the chessboard tipped over, but not in the way Lyle had anticipated. Chapter 9. Ashes and Phoenix. The Crystal Creek Medical Center's ICU waiting room was silent except for the soft crying of Madeline Thorne, comforted awkwardly by her older brother Braden. The teenager, lanky and dark-haired, bore a striking resemblance to Lyle at that age, a resemblance Lyle couldn't believe he'd missed in photographs. Dominic Thorne had survived his suicide attempt, but remained in critical condition. A combination of prescription medications and alcohol had nearly succeeded where his financial and legal troubles had pushed him. Lyle stood in the doorway, unnoticed by the children. His revenge had been meticulously planned, but this, Dominic taking the coward's way out, leaving his children to deal with the aftermath, had not been part of the calculation. Mr. Harrington, a nurse approached him. There's no family here except the minor children. The medical proxy paperwork lists you as the emergency contact for financial responsibility. Lyle frowned. That's not possible. I have no connection to Dominic Thorne's medical care. The nurse checked her tablet. The paperwork was updated this morning by Mrs. Thorne before she left town. She designated Harrington Holdings as the financially responsible party and you as the decision-maker in Mr. Thorne's care. A final manipulation by Valerie, ensuring Lyle would be forced to confront the human consequences of his revenge. Clever, even in defeat. As Lyle signed the necessary forms, a familiar figure approached from the hospital entrance, Preston Walsh, leaning heavily on a cane. I heard about Dominic, Preston said, his voice weak, and that the children were here alone. What are you doing here, Preston? You should be resting. Preston shrugged. Dying gives you perspective. Those kids need someone right now. Lyle glanced toward Braden and Madeline. Their mother abandoned them. Their father tried to kill himself rather than face consequences. What they need is beyond either of our capabilities. Maybe, Preston agreed. Or maybe they just need someone to give a damn. Before Lyle could respond, Braden approached them, his expression a mixture of anger and vulnerability that Lyle recognized all too well. You're him, aren't you? The guy who took everything from my dad. There was no question in his tone. Lyle met the boy's gaze, his son's gaze. Your father made choices, Braden. Illegal choices that caught up with him. Because of you, you set him up, ruined him on purpose. Yes, Lyle didn't deny it. I did, just as he once did to me. Braden seemed taken aback by the honesty. Why? What did he ever do to you? Preston interjected gently. It's a long, complicated story, son. One that started before you were born. Then I deserve to know, Braden insisted. Especially if my dad doesn't make it. Lyle considered the boy in front of him. 14 years old. The same age Lyle had been when his own father first became ill. The same stubborn chin. The same intensity in his eyes. Yes, Lyle said finally. You do deserve to know. But not here, not now. That evening, after ensuring the children were settled with a social worker Aurora had arranged, Lyle returned to the hotel. The revenge he had plotted for 15 years had succeeded beyond his expectations. yet he felt strangely hollow. His phone chirped with a message from Aurora. Valerie Thorne apprehended at Canadian border. Federal charges pending for financial crimes separate from Dominic's case. Justice, or at least its legal approximation, was being served. Yet as Lyle stood at the window overlooking Crystal Creek, the town he had left in defeat and returned to in triumph, he found himself thinking not of Valerie or Dominic, but of Braden and Madeline. Innocent casualties in a war they never asked to be part of. A week later, Dominic Thorne regained consciousness, though his recovery would be lengthy. Valerie remained in federal custody, facing years in prison. The children, with no other family willing to take them, remained in temporary foster care. Lyle sat across from his attorney in the Harrington Holdings office, reviewing documents. "You're certain about this?" the attorney asked. "It's an enormous commitment." "I'm certain," Lyle replied, signing the guardianship petition. The trust fund structure ensures their education and future needs, regardless of their parents' legal situations. The legal guardianship is temporary until more permanent arrangements can be made. And the paternity disclosure? Lyle hesitated. "Not yet. Braden has enough to process right now. That conversation can wait until he's ready." As the attorney gathered the documents, he studied Lyle curiously. "If you don't mind my asking, after everything the Thorns did to you, why take responsibility for their children?" Lyle considered the question. "Because revenge, no matter how justified, doesn't change the past. It only determines what kind of future you're building." He thought of his own father's words, "Never leave a debt unpaid." These children are owed a chance. That's a debt I'm willing to pay. Later that day, Lyle visited Preston in the hospital, where his condition had worsened. They spoke quietly about arrangements for Preston's children, about the construction of a new Crystal Creek development, about everything except the past that had divided them. As Lyle rose to leave, Preston caught his arm with surprising strength. "You know what the strangest part of dying is? Realizing how much energy I wasted on bitterness and regret." His eyes, though clouded with pain, were clear with purpose. "Don't make my mistake, Lyle. You've had your revenge. Don't let it hollow you out like it did me." 3 months later, Preston Walsh was laid to rest in the Crystal Creek Cemetery. The funeral was small but dignified, attended by his children, several hotel employees who remembered him kindly, and Lyle, who stood slightly apart from the others. After the service, as others dispersed, Lyle remained at the gravesite. The revenge that had driven him for 15 years was complete. Dominic Thorne, though recovering, would likely serve prison time for financial crimes. Valerie had already been sentenced to 7 years. Their empire had crumbled, just as Lyle's once had. Yet standing there, Lyle felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that it was time to build something new from the ashes of the past. "Mr. Harrington?" Lyle turned to find Braden approaching hesitantly, Madeline a few steps behind him. "The social worker says you're petitioning for guardianship," Braden said, his expression guarded. "Why would you do that after everything?" Lyle looked at the boy, his son, and chose his words carefully. "Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something better than they ever could." Braden's eyes, so like his own, studied him intently. "Does that include us?" "If you want it to," Lyle replied honestly. "The choice is yours." As they walked together toward the waiting car, Lyle glanced back at Preston's grave. His oldest friend, his worst betrayer, his final guide. Preston had been right. Revenge alone was a hollow victory. The real challenge, the true test of a man's character, was what he built after the fire had burned everything away. Lyle Harrington, once broken by betrayal, had returned to Crystal Creek for vengeance. He would leave it with something he hadn't expected, a future. Not forgiveness, never that, but perhaps something stronger. A legacy built not on the ruins of his enemies, but on the foundation of what came after revenge. The helicopter waited on the landing pad, Harrington Aviation logo gleaming in the sunlight. A new beginning. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Steve Murray had built his life like he built everything else, methodically, deliberately, and with an unforgiving attention to detail. At 42, he stood 6 feet tall, with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness during his 12 years as a military contractor in conflict zones. Those eyes missed nothing, a trait that had kept him alive in places where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. His wife, Christy Murray, had once found that intensity attractive. They'd met 15 years ago when she was a young nurse at Walter Reed Medical Center, treating wounded soldiers returning from overseas. Steve had been recovering from shrapnel wounds, and Christy's gentle touch and warm smile had been a beacon of hope in his darkest moments. She was beautiful then, honey blonde hair, emerald eyes, and a laugh that could light up a room. But beauty, Steve had learned, was often just a mask for rottenness beneath. Their son, Johnny Murray, was 8 years old and possessed an unsettling intelligence that sometimes made Steve wonder if the boy saw too much. Johnny had inherited his father's sharp eyes and his mother's quick wit, creating a combination that often left adults uncomfortable. The kid noticed everything: the way people looked at each other, the subtle changes in voice tone, the lies adults told thinking children wouldn't understand. Christy's mother, Martha Singleton, had lived with him for the past 3 years after suffering a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. The woman had never liked Steve, viewing him as too hard, too unforgiving for her precious daughter. She'd made no secret of her belief that Christy had married beneath herself, that she deserved someone more refined, more cultured than a man who'd made his living in war zones. Steve had tolerated Martha's presence for Christy's sake, converting the ground floor study into a bedroom and hiring a part-time caregiver, Merle Underwood, to help during the day. Merle was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd seen enough family drama to fill several lifetimes. She had a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, traits that made her excellent at her job, but sometimes uncomfortable to be around. The Murray household appeared picture-perfect from the outside. Their colonial-style home in the affluent suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, boasted manicured lawns and the kind of neighbors who minded their own business. Steve's security consulting firm provided them with a comfortable lifestyle, not wealthy, but secure. Christy worked part-time at a local clinic, claiming she wanted to maintain her nursing skills while caring for her mother. But perfection, Steve knew, was often an illusion maintained by those with the most to hide. The first crack in that illusion had appeared 6 months ago, though Steve hadn't recognized it at the time. Christy had started working longer hours, claiming the clinic was short-staffed. She'd begun paying more attention to her appearance. New clothes, expensive perfume, trips to the salon that seemed to happen with increasing frequency. When Steve had commented on it, she'd laughed it off, saying she needed to feel good about herself while dealing with her mother's condition. Johnny had been the first to notice the changes in his mother's behavior. Children, Steve reflected, were often the best lie detectors. They hadn't yet learned to ignore their instincts in favor of social politeness. Johnny had started asking why Mommy smiled differently now, why she laughed at things that weren't funny, why she always seemed to be looking at her phone. Steve's own military-honed instincts had been dulled by 15 years of domestic life, but they weren't dead. When Christy started receiving calls that made her step outside to talk, when she began taking her phone to the bathroom, when she started volunteering for weekend shifts that somehow never appeared on her official schedule, the old paranoia began to surface. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years in places where everyone was potentially an enemy, where survival depended on reading people's true intentions. He'd come home to what should have been safety, only to discover that the enemy might be sleeping in his own bed. But Steve Murray was not a man who acted on suspicion alone. He was methodical, patient, and thorough. If Christy was betraying him, he would know for certain before he acted. And when he did act, it would be with the same calculated precision that had made him legendary among his former colleagues. He began watching, waiting, and planning. Because Steve Murray had learned long ago that in any conflict, the side that struck first and struck hardest was usually the side that walked away. Chapter 2. Shadows and Whispers. The revelation came in pieces, like a puzzle Steve was reluctant to complete. It started with small inconsistencies. Christy claiming to work late shifts that didn't exist, expensive gifts she claimed came from grateful patients, and a new lightness in her step that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with secrets. Perry Fisher entered their lives like a cancer disguised as medicine. At 38, Perry was everything Steve wasn't. Smooth where Steve was rough, charming where Steve was direct, and possessed of the kind of easy smile that made people forget to ask hard questions. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd started visiting Christie's clinic 6 months ago, always impeccably dressed in designer suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Perry had a reputation that preceded him. Divorced twice, with a history of relationships that ended when the women discovered his true nature. Selfish, manipulative, and utterly without conscience. He collected married women like trophies, seeming to take particular pleasure in destroying stable families. Christie, with her combination of beauty and vulnerability, had proven irresistible. The first time Steve met Perry was at a hospital charity event Christie had insisted they attend. Perry had approached their table with the confidence of a man who believed his own lies, extending a manicured hand and flashing that practiced smile. "You must be Steve," Perry had said, his grip deliberately firm as if trying to prove something. "Christy talks about you all the time." Steve's handshake had been brief but crushing, his eyes never leaving Perry's face. In that moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of a challenge issued and accepted. Perry's smile had faltered slightly, and Steve had seen something flicker in the man's eyes. Fear, maybe, or the sudden understanding that he was playing a dangerous game. But Perry Fisher was a man who confused charm with intelligence, charisma with cunning. He'd continued his pursuit of Christie, mistaking Steve's initial restraint for weakness. Johnny had been the one to unknowingly provide the confirmation Steve needed. Children, with their brutal honesty, often revealed truths that adults worked hard to hide. "Daddy," Johnny had said one evening while they watched television together, "why does Mommy smell like that man from the hospital?" Steve's blood had gone cold. "What man, son?" "The one with the shiny shoes and the fake smile. He smells like expensive soap and lies." Out of the mouths of babes, Steve had thought. Even 8-year-old could see what Perry Fisher really was. The surveillance began the next day. Steve's years in the field had taught him patience and attention to detail. He hired a private investigator, Sam Davidson, a former military police officer who owed Steve his life from their time in Afghanistan. Sam was discreet, thorough, and understood the importance of documentation that would hold up under scrutiny. The evidence accumulated like drops of poison in a cup. Photos of Christie and Perry entering hotels during her supposed work hours. Credit card records showing purchases of jewelry and lingerie that never made it home. Text messages recovered from Christie's phone backups that detailed their affair in graphic, nauseating detail. But the most damning evidence was something far more insidious. Perry Fisher, it turned out, had been using his relationship with Christie to gain access to patient information, selling medical data to insurance companies for premium adjustments. He'd turned Christie into an unwitting accomplice, convincing her to provide him with files under the guise of helping patients with their medication costs. Steve had found Christie's laptop one evening, left carelessly open on the kitchen table. The email trail was there for anyone to see. Confidential patient information being forwarded to Perry's personal account, pharmaceutical company kickbacks being deposited into a joint account Christie didn't know Steve had discovered. The betrayal was complete. Not only had Christie violated their marriage vows, but she'd also compromised her professional ethics and potentially destroyed the lives of countless patients whose private medical information had been sold to the highest bidder. Martha Singleton, Steve realized, had known about the affair from the beginning. The old woman's increasing hostility toward him, her pointed comments about Christie deserving better, her knowing smiles when Perry's name was mentioned. It all made sense now. She'd been encouraging her daughter's infidelity, perhaps seeing it as a way to finally drive Steve from their lives. But Steve Murray was not a man who simply walked away. He was a man who understood that betrayal had consequences, that actions demanded accountability. The question wasn't whether he would respond to this betrayal. It was how completely he would destroy those who had dared to cross him. As he sat in his study that night, reviewing the evidence Sam had provided, Steve began a plan. Not just for divorce, not just for separation, but for something far more comprehensive. Christy and Perry had made the mistake of underestimating him, of believing that 15 years of marriage had made him soft. They were about to learn otherwise. Chapter 3. The Discovery. The truth hit Steve like a sledgehammer on a quiet Tuesday evening when he returned home earlier than expected from a canceled business meeting. His key turned silently in the lock, a skill learned in places where noise could mean death, and he stepped into his own home like a stranger entering enemy territory. The sound from upstairs left no room for doubt or denial. Christy's voice, breathless with passion she'd never shown him, mixed with Perry's arrogant laughter. They were in his bed, in his home, while his son played video games in a basement and his mother-in-law pretended to watch television in her ground-floor bedroom. Steve stood frozen in his own foyer, 15 years of marriage crashing down around him like a demolished building. The rage that filled him was pure and clean, the kind of fury that had once made him legendary among his unit. But he'd learned control over the years, learned to channel that rage into something useful, something surgical. He backed out of the house as silently as he'd entered, sitting in his car for 20 minutes until his hands stopped shaking. When he returned, he entered through the front door normally, calling out Christy's name as if nothing had happened. She appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, her hair hastily arranged, her cheeks flushed. "You're home early," she said, and Steve marveled at how easily the lie came to her lips. "Meeting was canceled," he replied, studying her face for any sign of guilt or remorse. There was none. If anything, she seemed annoyed by his unexpected return. That night, as Christy slept peacefully beside him, Steve lay awake staring at the ceiling and planning. The woman next to him had shared his bed for 15 years, had borne his child, had sworn before God and witnesses to honor and cherish him. Now she was nothing more than an enemy in his midst, more dangerous than any insurgent he'd ever faced because she had access to everything he cared about. The next morning, Steve made a phone call to Alan Fisher, his attorney and one of the few men he trusted completely. Alan was a shark in an expensive suit, a man who understood that sometimes the law was a weapon to be wielded rather than a shield to hide behind. "I need to see you," Steve said simply. Today, Alan's office was a monument to his success. Floor-to-ceiling law books, awards, and photographs with politicians and celebrities. But the man himself was unpretentious, direct, and ruthless when necessary. "What can I do for you, Steve?" Alan asked, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey despite the early hour. Steve laid out the evidence systematically, the photos, the financial records, the communication logs. Alan listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is comprehensive," Alan said finally. "More than enough for divorce proceedings. We can take her for everything: adultery, breach of trust, potentially criminal conspiracy if we can prove she knew about the medical data sales." "That's not enough," Steve said quietly. Alan raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about justice. Real justice. The kind that makes examples of people who think they can destroy lives without consequences." "Steve," Alan said carefully, "you need to be very careful here. I know what you're capable of, what you've done overseas. But this is America, and these are civilians." Steve's smile was cold as winter steel. "Perry Fisher forfeited his civilian status the moment he entered my house. And Christy," he paused, something dark and final settling in his eyes. "Christy made her choice." That afternoon, Steve placed another call, this one to Ian Hansen, a man who existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, between justice and revenge. Ian ran a security company that specialized in problem-solving for clients who couldn't or wouldn't involve traditional law enforcement. I need a consultation, Steve said when Ian answered. Personal or professional? Both. Ian's office was in a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place that legitimate businesses used as fronts for less legitimate activities. Ian himself was unremarkable. Average height, brown hair, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. It was a useful trait in his line of work. What's the situation? Ian asked after Steve had outlined the basics. Total destruction, Steve replied. I want them to lose everything. Reputation, livelihood, relationships, self-respect. I want them to understand that crossing Steve Murray comes with consequences that last a lifetime. Ian nodded slowly. That kind of operation requires precision. It's not cheap, and there's no going back once we start. Money isn't an issue, and I've never believed in going back. As Steve drove home that evening, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The die was cast, the plans were in motion. Christy and Perry had made their choices, and now they would live with the consequences. But first, he had to protect the one innocent party in this mess, his son Johnny. The boy would need to be prepared for what was coming, would need to understand that sometimes good people had to do terrible things to protect themselves and those they loved. Because Steve Murray was about to wage war, and in war, there were no prisoners taken. Chapter 4. The Architect of Ruin. Steve's planning was meticulous, drawing on years of operational experience where failure meant death. He established a war room in his home office, complete with surveillance photos, financial records, and detailed dossiers on both Christie and Perry. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, every weakness identified, every pressure point mapped with surgical precision. The first phase of his plan required patience and careful observation. Steve began documenting Christie's daily routine, noting when she left for work, when she returned, and the growing frequency of her overtime shifts that coincided with Perry's sales calls in the area. He installed hidden cameras throughout their home, not in bedrooms or bathrooms, but in common areas where conversations might reveal useful intelligence. What he discovered was worse than adultery. Christie and Perry weren't just having an affair. They were actively planning to destroy Steve's life together. The recordings captured their late-night phone conversations when Christie thought he was asleep, their discussions about liquidating assets, their mockery of his military service, and their belief that he was too damaged by combat to fight back effectively. He's just a broken soldier, Christie had laughed during one conversation. All that tough guy stuff is just compensation for how weak he really is inside. He'll probably just drink himself to death when I leave him. Perry's response had been even more revealing. The idiot doesn't even know about the medical data operation. Once we get enough money together, we can disappear to Costa Rica and let him deal with the legal fallout. He'll probably end up in federal prison. That conversation had been the final straw. They weren't just betraying him. They were planning to frame him for their crimes while stealing his assets and destroying his reputation. It was a level of malicious planning that elevated their betrayal from personal to professional. Steve's second call was to Jesse O'Connor, a forensic accountant who specialized in untangling complex financial crimes. Jessie was a small, intense woman with the ability to follow money trails that others couldn't even see. She'd helped Steve expose corruption in military contracting overseas, and her work had saved the lives of countless soldiers. I need you to examine some financial records, Steve told her during their meeting at a downtown coffee shop. I suspect my wife and her boyfriend are involved in medical data theft and insurance fraud. Jessie's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that made her dangerous to criminals and invaluable to those seeking justice. How deep do you want me to dig? All the way to bedrock. I want to know every dollar they've stolen, every law they've broken, every victim they've created. Within a week, Jessie had uncovered a web of fraud that stretched back 3 years. Perry Fisher wasn't just selling medical data. He was part of a larger operation that involved falsifying insurance claims, manipulating medication prices, and denying coverage to patients with expensive conditions. Christie's patient files have been used to identify and target the most vulnerable victims. The scope of their crimes was staggering. Hundreds of patients have been affected, with many losing their insurance coverage or being forced to pay exorbitant prices for life-saving medications. Several elderly patients had died after being unable to afford their treatments, victims of Perry and Christie's greed. Steve stared at the evidence spread across his desk and felt the cold fury that had once made him feared in combat zones around the world. These weren't just personal betrayals. They were crimes against innocent people, many of whom reminded him of his own aging mother-in-law. The irony was bitter. Christie was caring for her mother while simultaneously destroying other families' elderly relatives. But Martha Singleton's role in the conspiracy was more complex than Steve had initially realized. The old woman wasn't just aware of the affair. She was actively facilitating it. Security footage from the hospital where she received physical therapy showed her meeting regularly with Perry, passing him information about Steve's schedule and activities. Martha had become Christie's co-conspirator, believing that destroying Steve would secure her daughter's future happiness. She'd failed to understand that Perry Fisher was a predator who would discard Christie the moment she became inconvenient or liability. Steve's third ally was Bradley Root, a former NSA analyst who now worked as a private cybersecurity consultant. Bradley could make digital evidence appear or disappear, could trace communications through the darkest corners of the internet, and could create electronic paper trails that would convince any jury. "I need comprehensive digital surveillance," Steve told Bradley during their meeting in the latter's home office. "I want to know every website they visit, every message they send, every financial transaction they make." Bradley's work revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Perry and Christie weren't just planning to flee to Costa Rica. They were planning to fake Perry's death in a car accident, allowing him to collect a substantial life insurance payout while Christie inherited Steve's assets through a carefully orchestrated divorce settlement. The plan was sophisticated and ruthless. Perry would disappear, Christie would play the grieving lover while taking Steve for everything he owned, and they would reunite in South America to live off their combined ill-gotten gains. Steve's reputation would be destroyed, his business ruined, and he would likely face criminal charges for crimes he'd never committed. It was a plan that might have worked against a normal man. But Steve Murray was not normal. He was a predator who'd learned his craft in the world's most dangerous places, and now that predator was focused entirely on destroying those who dared to threaten his family. As he reviewed the complete picture of their betrayal, Steve felt a familiar calm settle over him. It was the same feeling he'd experienced before major operations overseas, a cold, clear focus that eliminated everything except the mission at hand. Christie and Perry had declared war on him without realizing it. Now, they were about to discover what war with Steve Murray actually looked like. Chapter 5. Gathering the Storm. The next phase of Steve's operation required building a network of allies and assets that could execute his plan with surgical precision. He began by reaching out to old contact from his military contractor days, men and women who understood that sometimes justice required operating outside the conventional boundaries of law and order. Lorenzo Shepard was the first to join his cause. A former Marine Corps reconnaissance specialist, Lorenzo now ran a private investigation firm that specialized in cases the police couldn't or wouldn't touch. He was built like a linebacker, but moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, and his specialty was making people disappear. Not permanently, but long enough for them to understand the consequences of their actions. "You want them destroyed, not just exposed," Lorenzo said after reviewing Steve's intelligence package. It wasn't a question. "Complete destruction," Steve confirmed. "I want them to lose everything they've stolen, everything they've built on lies, and everything they think they deserve." Lorenzo smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. That kind of operation requires careful coordination. "We'll need someone who understands the legal system from the inside." That someone turned out to be Greg Warren, a federal prosecutor who'd grown disgusted with the limitations of working within a system that often protected the wealthy and connected at the expense of their victims. Greg had quietly left the Department of Justice 6 months earlier to start his own practice, specializing in cases that mainstream prosecutors wouldn't touch. "The medical data fraud case is ironclad," Greg told them during a secure meeting at Lorenzo's office. "We have documentation of hundreds of victims, clear evidence of financial gain, and a conspiracy that crosses state lines. Perry Fisher and your wife are looking at federal charges that could put them away for decades. That's not enough, Steve said flatly. Prison is just temporary punishment. I want permanent consequences. Greg raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? I want them to experience the same helplessness their victims felt. I want them to lose their health insurance, their financial security, their ability to trust anyone around them. I want them to understand what it feels like to be completely powerless. The plan they developed was comprehensive and ruthless. Phase 1 would involve exposing the medical fraud to federal authorities while simultaneously destroying Perry's pharmaceutical sales network and Christie's nursing career. Phase 2 would target their personal relationships, revealing their true natures to friends, family, and colleagues. Phase 3 would be the most devastating, a coordinated attack on their psychological and emotional well-being that would leave them broken and isolated. But Steve's most important ally was someone much closer to home. Johnny had been watching his parents' marriage deteriorate with the sharp eyes of a child who understood more than adults gave him credit for. At 8 years old, he'd already learned to read the subtle signs of deception, to notice when his mother's smiles didn't reach her eyes, to understand that the tension in the house had nothing to do with his grandmother's condition. "Dad," Johnny said one evening while they worked on a model airplane together, "are you and Mom getting divorced?" Steve looked at his son, seeing intelligence and pain in those young eyes. "What makes you ask that, buddy?" "She talks to someone on the phone when she thinks I'm not listening. She says things about you that aren't nice. And she smells different now, like someone else's cologne." Steve set down his tools and faced his son directly. "Sometimes adults make bad choices, Johnny. Sometimes people we trust decide to hurt us. When that happens, we have to protect ourselves and the people we love. Are you going to protect us?" Johnny asked. "Yes," Steve said simply, "but I need you to help me." "Can you do that?" Johnny nodded solemnly. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to watch and listen. If you see or hear anything that doesn't seem right, you tell me immediately. And if I ever tell you to go somewhere or do something, even if it seems strange, you do it without asking questions. Can you promise me that?" "I promise, Dad." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Johnny became Steve's eyes and ears inside the house, reporting on his mother's phone calls, her visitors, and her increasingly erratic behavior. The boy understood that his family was under attack and that his father was the only one strong enough to defend them. Martha Singleton's role in the conspiracy became clearer as Johnny's intelligence gathering improved. The old woman was more than just an enabler. She was actively coordinating with Perry to monitor Steve's movements and activities. She'd been using her physical therapy appointments as opportunities to meet with Perry and pass along information about Steve's business travels, his daily routine, and his relationship with Johnny. "Grandma talks to the bad man, too," Johnny reported one evening. "She tells him we're going to be away for work and when I'll be at school. She thinks you're stupid and that Mom deserves someone better." Steve felt his jaw tighten. Martha's betrayal was perhaps the most bitter of all. He'd welcomed her into his home, cared for her during her illness, and treated her with respect despite her obvious dislike of him. Her reward for his kindness had been to actively participate in destroying his family. But Martha Singleton had made a crucial error in judgment. She'd underestimated the bond between Steve and his son, had assumed that Johnny would remain loyal to his mother and grandmother regardless of their actions. Instead, the boy had chosen to stand with the parent who'd never lied to him, who'd never broken a promise, who'd always treated him with respect and honesty. As the evidence mounted and his plan solidified, Steve began to feel the cold satisfaction that came with having his enemies exactly where he wanted them. Christy, Perry, and Martha all believed they were winning, that their conspiracy was succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. They had no idea that their every move was being monitored, their every communication intercepted, their every weakness cataloged by a man who'd learned warfare in places where mercy was a fatal weakness. The storm was gathering, and soon it would break over their heads with devastating force. Chapter 6: The Trap Springs. The funeral of Martha Singleton would be the centerpiece of Steve's revenge. a carefully orchestrated event that would expose every betrayal and destroy every lie his enemies had built their lives upon. But first, Martha actually had to die, and Steve was patient enough to let nature take its course. Martha's second stroke came 3 weeks after Steve had completed his surveillance operation. This one was massive, leaving her completely paralyzed and barely conscious. The doctors gave her days to live, and Christy threw herself into playing the role of the grieving daughter while secretly planning her escape with Perry. Steve used Martha's deteriorating condition as an opportunity to install additional surveillance equipment in the house under the guise of monitoring her health. Every room except the bathrooms now contained hidden cameras and microphones, creating a comprehensive intelligence-gathering network that captured every conversation, every phone call, every intimate moment between Christy and Perry. The recordings from those final weeks were devastating. Christy and Perry discussed their escape plans in Martha's presence, believing the dying woman couldn't understand their words. They talked about the money they'd stolen, the lives they'd destroyed, and their plans to frame Steve for their crimes. Most damning of all, they discussed accelerating Martha's death with an overdose of morphine, making it appear that Steve had killed his mother-in-law in a fit of rage. "The old bitch is taking too long to die," Perry had complained during one of his visits. "We need to move our timeline up before someone starts asking questions about the missing data." "I can give her extra morphine," Christy had replied. "Make it look like Steve lost his temper and overdosed her. Everyone knows he's been under stress, and his military background will make him seem unstable." Steve listened to that conversation with the cold fury of a man who'd seen the absolute worst of human nature. They weren't just planning to murder a helpless old woman. They were planning to destroy his life in the process. The fact that Martha had been complicit in their conspiracy didn't diminish the evil of what they were proposing. But Steve had learned patience in war zones where acting too quickly could get you killed. He documented their murder conspiracy while simultaneously taking steps to ensure that Martha would die naturally before they could implement their plan. He arranged for a different hospice nurse, Melody Swan, to provide round-the-clock care, effectively preventing Christy and Perry from having unsupervised access to the dying woman. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning, her conspiracy dying with her. Christy's performance as the grieving daughter was Academy Award-worthy, complete with tears, dramatic collapses, and heartfelt speeches about her mother's courage and dignity. The funeral arrangements became Steve's masterpiece of psychological warfare. He insisted on a large service, inviting everyone who'd known Martha, her friends from church, her former colleagues from the hospital where she'd worked as a volunteer, her neighbors, and her extended family. Perry would attend, of course, playing the role of the supportive family friend, while secretly celebrating the removal of the final obstacle to his and Christy's escape. But Steve had other plans for Perry Fisher. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones. Steve dressed carefully in his dress uniform, complete with his service ribbons and decorations, a subtle reminder to everyone present of exactly who they were dealing with. Christy appeared genuinely surprised by his choice of attire. "Why are you wearing your uniform?" she asked, and Steve noted the hint of nervousness in her voice. "I thought your mother deserved the respect of a military funeral," he replied. "She was family, after all." The first phase of his plan activated when they arrived at the funeral home. Lorenzo Shepard was waiting in the parking lot, dressed as a member of the funeral home staff. His job was simple: ensure that Perry Fisher never made it inside the building. Steve watched through the funeral home's front window as Lorenzo approached Perry's Mercedes in the parking lot. There was a brief conversation, then Perry slumped forward against his steering wheel. Lorenzo had used a fast-acting sedative that would leave Perry unconscious but unharmed, a professional technique that left no trace and caused no permanent damage. Perry's absence didn't go unnoticed, but Christy was too focused on playing her role as the grieving daughter to show more than mild concern. She assumed he'd been delayed by business and would arrive later. The second phase began during the service itself. Steve had arranged for several special guests to attend: federal agents from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, investigators from the State Medical Board, and victims of Perry and Christie's medical data theft operation. They sat quietly in the back of the room, their presence unknown to Christie but visible to Steve. As the minister delivered his eulogy for Martha, Steve's phone buzzed with a text message from Johnny, who was supposed to be in school. "Dad, don't go to the burial. Come home now. Police cars outside our house." Steve felt a moment of pride at his son's quick thinking and reliable intelligence. Johnny had been watching the house as instructed, ready to provide warning if anything unexpected happened. The presence of police cars meant that Phase 3 of his plan was proceeding on schedule. Steve excused himself from the service, claiming he needed to check on something at home. Christie was too absorbed in accepting condolences from Martha's friends to pay much attention to his departure. As he walked toward his car, Steve felt the same calm focus that had carried him through countless dangerous missions overseas. The trap was springing exactly as planned, and his enemies were about to discover that Steve Murray was not the broken soldier they'd assumed him to be. Chapter 7. The Sun's Warning. The drive home through the Richmond suburbs felt like a march toward destiny. Steve's mind was calm, organized, the way it had been during his most dangerous operations overseas. Every detail of the past months had led to this moment. Every lie cataloged, every betrayal documented, every weakness exploited. His phone rang as he turned onto his street. Johnny's voice was tense, but controlled, displaying the kind of composure that made Steve proud of his son's strength. "Dad, there are 3 police cars in our driveway and an unmarked van across the street. I can see men with suits talking to our neighbors. What should I do?" "Stay exactly where you are," Steve instructed. "Do not answer the door for anyone. I'm 2 minutes away." Steve parked at the end of the block and surveyed the scene. Johnny's intelligence had been accurate. 3 marked police vehicles sat in his driveway, while federal agents conducted interviews with neighbors up and down the street. This was the culmination of months of careful coordination between himself, Greg Warren, and federal law enforcement. Detective Al Powell approached his car as Steve stepped out. Al was a 20-year veteran of the Richmond Police Department who'd worked several cases involving military contractors and understood the complexities of dealing with men like Steve. "Mr. Murray," Al said, his voice carefully neutral, "we need to discuss something important about your mother-in-law." Steve nodded, maintaining the appearance of a concerned son-in-law. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" "We've received allegations that Mrs. Singleton was involved in a medical fraud conspiracy. We also have evidence suggesting that you may have been targeted for identity theft and financial fraud by individuals close to your family." The words were carefully chosen, designed to inform Steve that law enforcement was on his side while maintaining the appearance of a standard investigation. Greg Warren had orchestrated this beautifully, ensuring that Steve would appear to be a victim rather than the architect of his enemy's destruction. "I don't understand," Steve said, playing his part perfectly. "What kind of conspiracy?" Al gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside. We have some evidence we'd like you to review." As they walked toward the front door, Steve noticed Johnny watching from an upstairs window. The boy's presence reminded him why he'd undertaken this elaborate campaign of revenge. Not just to punish those who betrayed him, but to protect the one person in this mess who'd remained completely innocent. Inside, the house had been transformed into a command center for multiple law enforcement agencies. FBI agents were examining Christie's computer and financial records, while State Medical Board investigators reviewed patient files that had been recovered from Perry's apartment. The scope of the operation was impressive, a testament to the thoroughness of Steve's planning and Greg Warren's connections within the system. Agent Clarence Nguyen from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division was coordinating the investigation. He was a small, intense man with the kind of attention to detail that made him dangerous to criminals and valuable to prosecutors. "Mr. Murray," Agent Nguyen said, "we need to inform you that your wife and an individual named Perry Fisher are subjects in a federal investigation involving healthcare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. We believe you may have been a victim of their activities." Steve's performance as the shocked husband was flawless. "Christie? That's impossible. She's a nurse. She would never do anything to hurt patients." Agent Nguyen produced a thick folder of evidence. I'm afraid the documentation suggests otherwise. We have evidence that Mrs. Murray has been providing confidential patient information to Mr. Fisher, who has been selling that data to insurance companies. The scheme has affected hundreds of patients and resulted in several deaths due to denied coverage. As Steve reviewed the evidence with apparent shock and growing anger, he marveled at how completely the trap had closed around Christy and Perry. Every piece of evidence had been legally obtained, properly documented, and presented in a way that made their guilt undeniable. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. We also have evidence, Agent Nguyen continued, that your wife and Mr. Fisher have been planning to frame you for their crimes while stealing your assets and fleeing the country. They've been using your mother-in-law as an intermediary to gather intelligence about your activities and schedule. Steve's hands trembled as he processed this information, not from genuine shock, but from the effort required to maintain his performance. Martha was helping them? I'm afraid so. Mrs. Singleton was fully aware of their plans and actively participated in the conspiracy. They were planning to accelerate her death using an overdose of morphine and blame you for her murder. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Even the hardened law enforcement officers present seemed shaken by the scope and viciousness of the conspiracy that had been uncovered. Where's my wife now? Steve asked. Still at the funeral, we believe. We have units standing by to arrest both her and Mr. Fisher as soon as we complete our evidence collection here. Steve pulled out his phone and called Johnny downstairs. When his son appeared, Steve knelt down to meet the boy's eyes directly. Son, do you remember what I told you about sometimes having to protect the people we love? Johnny nodded solemnly. These police officers are here because some people made very bad choices. Mom and Grandma were involved with a bad man who hurt a lot of innocent people. They were planning to hurt us too. Johnny's young face showed understanding beyond his years. Are they going to jail? Yes, Steve said simply. They're going to jail for a very long time. As if on cue, Steve's phone rang. Christie's name appeared on the screen, and Agent Nguyen nodded for him to answer. Steve, Christie's voice was panicked, frantic. Something's happened to Perry. He's in his car in the funeral home parking lot. He's unconscious. And there are people here asking questions about patient files and insurance fraud. I think someone's trying to set us up. Steve met Agent Nguyen's eyes and nodded. The final act was beginning. Christy, Steve said, his voice cold as Arctic wind. I think you need to come home. We need to talk. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. Christy arrived home to find her world completely transformed. The police cars, federal agents, and evidence collection teams painted a picture of justice that she hadn't anticipated in her worst nightmares. As she walked through her front door, Christy's face cycled through confusion, fear, and finally a dawning understanding that her carefully constructed lies were crumbling around her. Steve watched from the living room as Agent Nguyen approached Christy with handcuffs and a federal arrest warrant. Her performance as the confused, innocent wife was impressive, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Christine Murray, Agent Nguyen announced formally, "You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of federal patient privacy laws." Christy's eyes found Steve across the room, and for a moment her mask slipped completely. He saw the real her, calculating, manipulative, and completely without remorse. She'd been caught, not because she'd made a mistake, but because she'd underestimated the man she'd betrayed. "Steve," she said, trying one last manipulation, "you have to help me. This is all a mistake. I would never hurt you or Johnny." Steve's response was delivered with the cold precision of a military briefing. "Agent Nguyen, I believe you should know that my wife has been systematically poisoning our son against me while planning to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. She's also been having an affair with Perry Fisher for the past 8 months, using our home for their meetings while my mother-in-law provided intelligence about my schedule." Christy's facade cracked completely. "You bastard. You've been spying on me." "I've been protecting my family," Steve corrected, "from people who threatened our safety and well-being." The arrest proceeded smoothly, with Christy's protests and accusations falling on deaf ears. The evidence was too comprehensive too well documented for her denials to carry any weight. As they led her away, she looked back at Steve one final time. "You'll never prove I knew about the medical data," she spat. "And you'll never get custody of Johnny. I'll make sure you lose everything." Steve's smile was colder than January steel. "Christy, you still don't understand. You've already lost everything." Perry Fisher's arrest had been equally satisfying, though considerably more dramatic. When he'd awakened from Lorenzo's sedative in the funeral home parking lot, he'd found himself surrounded by FBI agents and local police. His attempts to flee had been pathetic, a man in expensive shoes trying to outrun trained law enforcement officers across wet grass. The evidence against Perry was even more damning than what they had on Christy. His apartment had yielded computers full of stolen medical data, financial records showing payments from insurance companies, and detailed plans for his and Christy's escape to Costa Rica. Most devastating of all were the recorded conversations where he discussed accelerating Martha's death and framing Steve for murder. But Steve's revenge extended far beyond simple criminal prosecution. While Christy and Perry sat in federal holding cells awaiting trial, Steve's network of allies began implementing the psychological warfare phase of their destruction. Lorenzo Shepard had spent weeks building detailed profiles of Christy and Perry's friends, family members, and professional contacts. Now he began systematically contacting each person, providing them with carefully selected evidence of their true natures. Christy's nursing colleagues received copies of the stolen patient files. Perry's ex-wives learned about his pattern of targeting married women for financial gain. Their friends and neighbors discovered the depth of their betrayal and the lives they destroyed. The social destruction was swift and complete. Christy's nursing license was permanently revoked by the state medical board. Perry's pharmaceutical sales certifications were canceled by every major drug company. Their professional reputations were utterly destroyed, ensuring that they would never again be able to work in healthcare or any field requiring trust and integrity. But Steve's most devastating weapon was the truth itself. He arranged for the families of patients who died due to denied coverage to learn exactly who was responsible for their loved ones' deaths. 12 families in total, each representing someone who died because Christy and Perry's greed had cost them their insurance coverage. The civil lawsuits began immediately, with each family seeking damages not just for medical expenses, but for wrongful death, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The total liability exceeded $20 million, far more than Christy and Perry could ever hope to pay even if they avoided federal prison. Johnny handled the revelation about his mother with a maturity that both impressed and saddened Steve. The boy had already understood that something was fundamentally wrong with their family dynamic, and the confirmation of his suspicions seemed to bring him relief rather than additional trauma. "Dad," Johnny said one evening as they sat together in Steve's study, "are you sad about Mom?" Steve considered the question carefully. "I'm sad about what she chose to become. The woman I married wouldn't have done these things. But people change, and sometimes they change into someone we don't recognize." "Will I see her again?" "Probably not for a very long time," Steve said honestly. "She's going to be in prison, and even after she gets out, she won't be the same person." Johnny nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Good." She wasn't a good mom anymore. The federal trial proceeded with the swift efficiency that characterized cases with overwhelming evidence. Christy and Perry both attempted to claim innocence, then tried to blame each other, and finally resorted to claiming they'd been manipulated by Steve's superior intelligence and military training. None of their defenses worked. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Christy received 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Perry received 20 years, with additional charges pending from other states where his insurance fraud had affected patients. Steve attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Christy and Perry could see him. He wanted them to understand that their destruction had been personal, deliberate, and complete. When the verdicts were read, he felt no satisfaction, only the cold peace that came with the successful completion of a necessary mission. Chapter 9. The Price of Betrayal. 5 years had passed since the trials, and Steve Murray's life had settled into a rhythm of quiet satisfaction and carefully maintained vigilance. Johnny, now 13, had grown into a sharp, confident young man who understood that strength came from loyalty and that betrayal carried consequences that lasted lifetimes. The house had been completely renovated after Christie's arrest, every room cleansed of her presence and the corruption she'd brought into their lives. Steve had kept only those possessions that held meaning for Johnny: photo albums from before the betrayal, family heirlooms that connected the boy to his heritage, memories from a time when their family had been whole. Christie's letters from federal prison arrived regularly, at first full of rage and accusations, then pleading for forgiveness and a second chance, and finally settling into a desperate acceptance of her situation. Steve read each one carefully before filing them away unread. Johnny had asked to see them once, when he was 12, and after reading 3 of them, had declared that he never wanted to see another. She still doesn't understand what she did wrong, Johnny had observed with a clear moral vision of youth. She thinks she's the victim. Perry Fisher had fared even worse. His attempts to manipulate the prison system had earned him enemies among both guards and inmates. Steve received regular updates on Perry's situation through contacts within the federal prison system. Not because he took pleasure in the man's suffering, but because understanding your enemy's current status was simply good tactical sense. The civil lawsuits had proceeded exactly as Steve had anticipated. Christie and Perry's assets had been seized and distributed among their victims' families, but the monetary damages were secondary to the psychological impact. Both had been forced to confront the human cost of their greed, to face the families of people who died because of their actions. Steve's security consulting business had flourished in the years following the trial. His reputation for thoroughness and absolute reliability had spread throughout the government contracting community, bringing him clients who needed problems solved with precision and discretion. He'd built a team of carefully vetted professionals who shared his values and understood that some betrayals could never be forgiven. Johnny had become his closest confidant and, in many ways, his greatest achievement. The boy possessed his father's analytical mind and his own innate sense of justice. He learned early that the world contained people who would smile while planning your destruction, and that survival required constant vigilance combined with decisive action when threats emerged. "Dad," Johnny said one evening as they worked on a new model airplane, "do you think Mom will ever get out of prison?" "Probably," Steve replied honestly. "She'll serve at least 12 years, but she might get parole after that if she behaves herself." "Will she try to contact us?" Steve set down his tools and looked directly at his son. "She might try, but you need to understand something important, Johnny. The woman in prison isn't the same person who used to be your mother. Prison changes people, and not always for the better. She's been consumed by anger and resentment for 5 years now, blaming everyone except herself for the choices she made. What if she comes back here?" "She won't," Steve said with quiet certainty. "She knows better than that." Johnny nodded, satisfied with this explanation. The boy had developed his father's ability to compartmentalize emotions, to deal with unpleasant realities without being consumed by them. He learned that some people forfeited their right to forgiveness through their actions, and that loyalty was earned rather than assumed. Steve's phone buzzed with a text message from Lorenzo Shepard. "Fisher found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide. Thought you should know." Steve deleted the message and continued working on the model airplane. Perry Fisher's death was neither surprising nor particularly meaningful. The man had been psychologically destroyed years ago, and his physical death was simply the final confirmation of his complete defeat. Christie would learn about Perry's death through the prison grapevine, and it would destroy whatever fragile hope she'd been maintaining about their eventual reunion. She would spend the remaining years of her sentence in the knowledge that her co-conspirator and lover had chosen death over continuing to live with the consequences of their actions. Steve felt no satisfaction at Perry's death, just as he'd felt no satisfaction at their convictions or their civil judgments. Justice wasn't about satisfaction. It was about consequences, about ensuring that actions had appropriate results, about protecting the innocent from those who would exploit their trust. Johnny finished attaching the wing assembly and held up the completed model for inspection. Perfect, Steve said, examining his son's work. Just like everything else you do. I learned from the best, Johnny replied with a grin that reminded Steve of happier times, before betrayal had taught them both hard lessons about human nature. As they cleaned up their workspace, Steve reflected on the path that had brought them to this point. He'd lost a wife and gained a deeper understanding of his son's character. He'd discovered that even the people closest to you could become enemies. But he'd also learned that some bonds, like the one between a father and son who'd survived betrayal together, were unbreakable. The house was quiet now, peaceful in a way it had never been during Christie's final years. There were no whispered phone calls, no secret meetings, no lies disguised as love. Johnny did his homework at the kitchen table while Steve prepared dinner, both of them comfortable in the silence that came from complete trust. Steve Murray had built his life on the principle that betrayal demanded consequences, that justice sometimes required operating outside conventional boundaries, and that some people forfeited their right to mercy through their actions. He taught his son these same principles, not through words, but through example. Christie would serve her time and eventually be released to a world that would never forgive or forget what she'd done. Perry Fisher had chosen his own ending, unable to live with the weight of his crimes and their consequences. Martha Singleton had died, knowing that her granddaughter would learn the truth about her betrayal. And Steve Murray continued forward, scarred but unbroken, protective of the one person who'd remained loyal when loyalty was tested. He'd proven that beneath the civilized surface of suburban life, the old rules still applied. Strength was respected, weakness was exploited, and betrayal was never, ever forgiven. The model airplane sat on the shelf next to dozens of others, each one representing an evening spent building something together, creating memories that would last long after the pain of betrayal had faded. Johnny would grow up understanding that some people could be trusted completely and others couldn't be trusted at all, and that the difference between the two was often a matter of life and death. Steve turned off the lights and locked the house for the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to protect what mattered most. He learned that revenge was best served not hot or cold, but with the calculated precision of a man who understood